Please welcome Sam Cassatt, Chief Strategy Officer of Consensus.
Hello. Thank you all for being here on this early morning after I'm sure you were all partying last night. So it's good to be here. I'm going to talk about something a little bit weird that's going to be outside of the realm of probably some of the other talks that you've seen today and yesterday. And it sort of tracks my own personal journey through why I'm doing this stuff in the first place. And I think if you were to get into the community of people around Consensus, around blockchain in general, they might have a sort of similar story, but maybe phrased differently. Consciousness is what I decided a long time ago that I want to devote my life to, and specifically making human consciousness better and more interesting and more beautiful for people. And that's really highly related to blockchain. And I'm going to tell you how I think about that and why I think they're related. So a lot of people have probably heard this quote or seen it. It's actually wrong. It was Henry Ford who said in substance this: "It is perhaps well enough that the people of the nation do not know or understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." This is actually a misquote in the House of Representatives. This is what he actually said. I just really like to be thorough. The scientist in me doesn't like putting false information up. So the reason I have this quote here is to illustrate the difference between what most people think about how the banking system, how the monetary system works, and how monetary theory works, and how it actually works. If you look at what Henry Ford actually said in this book, people are naturally conservative. They are more conservative than the financiers. Those who believe that the people are so easily led that they would permit the printing presses to run off money like milk tickets do not understand them. It is the innate conservation of the people that has kept our money good in spite of the fantastic tricks which financiers play and which they cover up with high technical terms. The people are on the side of sound money. They are so unalterably on the side of sound money that it is a serious question how they would regard the system under which they live if they once knew what the initiate can do with it. That sounds very doom and gloomy, but I think I'm going to illustrate to you why the system as it is not necessarily how it needs to be, and this is the revolution. This is the set of creativity that we're embarking on at Consensus and in the blockchain world, and I hope that gets across to you today. So, shekels and wheat demurrage. One idea I want to start with is just that the idea of what money is, the definition of money, is really malleable. And it's meant many different things throughout the course of history. Most people assume that how it is right now is how it always has been and how it will be. But I just want to point out some interesting properties, interesting characteristics of monetary systems that have existed in the past. So the word shekel actually comes from the root she and kel. She means wheat in ancient Sumerian, and kel means something like a bushel. And literally what a piece of money was in ancient Sumeria was a receipt, essentially, for taking a bushel of wheat and putting it at the temple, and some priestesses would keep it for you there. And then you can imagine people would take these IOUs of wheat and they could trade them and it would behave like money. The interesting property about wheat is that wheat decays over time. It's not worth the same as it was a week ago or 10 months ago. So what that ended up creating was what we would call in monetary theory demurrage. It was a demurrage currency, meaning that it actually devalues over time. And you can imagine if money devalues over time, if a dollar is worth 99 cents tomorrow, I have a high likelihood that I'm going to spend that money today, or I'm at least incentivized to do so. So the idea that demurrage currencies would accelerate the rate of the velocity of money through the economy is just one example of a sort of different economic structure. Does anyone know what these are? These are rye stones. So these are giant stones that are used in some tribal cultures, even to this day, I believe, that basically represent a piece of money. And they go and they chisel these out of a bigger rock or a mountain or something. They have to transport them long distances. Sometimes they put them in canoes. Sometimes they even fall out of the canoe into the water and it's underground, but it still is a piece of money. And what's interesting about this piece of money is that moving it is really difficult, obviously. You can't just carry this in your pocket. But the social construct around who owns this is actually what controls its payment mechanism as money, right? So even the ones that have fallen out of canoes, as long as everyone in the community agrees that I own this or Carolyn owns this or whatever, then that functions as money, right? So that's just another example of something that is, it's scarce. The society agrees that it's money. It's fungible. One stone is worth the same as another stone, et cetera. So it solves all these sort of problems that money solves, but it's dramatically different than what we think of as money right now. This is obviously a lot more complicated than either of those two monetary systems, but this is a little bit like what we have right now. So we have a bunch of central banks of various sorts. We have the IMF and the Bank for International Settlements that serves as a central bank to central banks. And then we have retail banks, consumer banks that sort of sit below those. And as opposed to going and digging up a piece of gold out of the ground or digging up one of these rhinestones out of the ground, this system creates money in a very different way. Does anyone know how money gets created? Like there's a dollar that didn't exist yesterday and now exists? How many people know how that works? Okay, this is a good audience for that. Most people don't know that. And if you told most people the answer to that question, they wouldn't believe you. And the answer is, some of these people in the middle essentially make it up out of thin air. They type it into a computer. They lend it at an interest rate that is determined at regular intervals by the central bank. In the US, the Fed decides the interest rate. And therefore, that's how expensive that money is, right? And that money gets borrowed by these other banks and some other various kinds of institutions. So they type it in a computer. They say, I'm going to give this bank $1 trillion. When we had quantitative easing, for instance, after the last financial recession, or after if we go back in time to other recessions, one of the ways that they try to fix things when they go poorly, when there's a liquidity crunch, when there's not enough money moving through the society, and we have something like what demurrage prevents, you don't have enough velocity of money through the society, then they lower the interest rate and they make that money cheaper. Then these banks at the top, they turn around and they go to normal consumers and businesses and they lend that money too, and they can also multiply that number, right? So say I get lent $1 trillion, I can lend $10 trillion. The actual number is depending on a number of factors, but they can lend a multiple, right? And that's called fractional reserve lending or fractional reserve banking. The interesting thing about this is that this has a lot to do with how humans motivate themselves, right? What does a typical family in America do? Like, what's the script, right? You go to school, you get a job, you probably take out a mortgage. That mortgage is made out of these tokens or these dollar units that are made out of thin air and then given to you. And then you spend a long time working and paying that back. And that's what causes the wheels of the economy to spin. And that's fine. That works okay. But there are a few problems with that. This guy, Mohammed El-Arian, is a very noted economist. He used to work at the European Central Bank. In this story, or it's a nonfiction book, but it's about the only game in town, which is the central bank, right? And he says essentially, central banks have been employing a single set of tools, or rather one tool for pretty much their entire history, in order to make the economy function well, right? And the way they do that is, like what I said, they have this valve, and they can open the valve by lowering the interest rates, and they can close the valve by increasing the interest rates. And that's how much money gets lent up that pyramid, and eventually to normal people. And that has a lot to do with their motivations as humans, right? That's how you imagine what makes you happy, like how is my life structured. There are some other problems with that too. Friedrich Hayek is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He wrote a book called The Denationalization of Money. And in this book, he argues that the eternal temptation of any state issuer of currency is to inflate that currency, right? And an alternative to that, an alternative to state-sanctioned currencies, would be that there could be a complementary system of currencies that voluntarily are created, that have different market dynamics, that are either good at being money and therefore have a high value, or bad at being money and therefore have a low value. That monies themselves could be subject to market pressures, just like a product is. When Friedrich Hayek says this, he is comparing this to people like Caesar, for instance, right? And the reason we've come to this point is that you need some way to make sure that the gold in the coin didn't get diluted, right? And 1,000 years ago, that was pretty difficult. We didn't have paper money, we didn't have the Fed, we didn't have blockchain and Ether. You needed to make sure that the money was real, though. And one way to make sure the money is real is Caesar can stamp his face on it, and if you go about making counterfeits, then we kill you. And that works pretty well, actually. but the problem is that Caesar eventually says, it would be really nice if I had an extra trillion or 5 to do a public works project, and then Caesar starts diluting it himself. Right? And so obviously that's what we do in central banking, that's what quantitative easing is. We've decided that we want to open the floodgates of the economy, make it move forward, which has legitimate purposes, but also is subject to this eternal temptation. And maybe if there were market pressures for monies, maybe if monies had to compete with each other, we'd have a much more interesting set of things that control our motivations in our economy. What I really want to drive home is that this has to do with how the human mind works. Money is a mode of organizing our life in the material world. Money is an invention, a mental device, very necessary, very ingenious, but in the end, a product of the mind. Jakub Needleman is a philosopher who writes about this stuff. And I think what he means here is that, in some sense, our neuroscience, the functioning of our brain, comes up with lots of mechanisms to help us value things, right? The way that we behave, the reason why I click on a button on Facebook, the reason why I feel happy when someone hugs me, the reason why I feel sad when something bad happens, those all have to do with neurotransmitters in our brain. It all has to do with coping strategies and planning mechanisms that are embedded into our cognition. But value systems, how do I value something? Why do I do something? What's an acceptable reward, right? When I go to work and I work all day and I get some money for working all day, that's an acceptable reward. It makes my brain function in a way that says, this is good enough for me. Trading my time for that money, those tokens, that was a good trade-off. Something lights up in my mind, and I said, yes, let's do it. Literally, inside your brain, there are systems that are designed to evaluate the value of things, right? So this sounds really fancy. This is in the journal Nature, which is kind of like the all-star league of scientific journals, if any scientists are out there. Parts of the limbic system associated with the midbrain dopamine system, including the paralimbic cortex, are preferentially activated by decisions involving immediately available rewards. In contrast, regions of the lateral prefrontal cortex and posterior parietal cortex are engaged uniformly by intertemporal choices irrespective of delay. It sounds really fancy, but all that says is that there are some parts of your brain that light up when something is going to be valuable in the future, and there are some parts of your brain that light up when something you get right now is good. So if I give you $1 million right now versus a 10% chance of $1 billion in 50 years, a lot of people would choose the former. And it's because we value things now and things in the future differently. And actually, these systems, the frontal cortex is often thought of as part of your brain that deals with longer-term planning in general. These are some pretty pictures of those two areas. In general, you should be skeptical of pretty pictures of brains because they convince people things that aren't true. Most neuroscientists would tell you they're skeptical of these things. However, it looks cool, but the point being, your brain lights up when you get money, and your brain lights up at the propositions of getting money in various circumstances, and in fact, it controls our behavior a lot. It's part of the expression of who we are. It's the externalization of part of our cognition into a monetary system that sits outside of us and controls human behavior, controls human consciousness. Nietzsche said money is the crowbar of power, right? You can use money. If I have lots of money, I can do things like hire armies, right? I can convince vast swaths of people to do vast things. We can light up our brain in a way that makes us behave in a certain way, even at very vast scales, with high amounts of leverage. But maybe we should rethink that. Maybe we should consider what other mechanisms are available. Rye stones look a lot like blockchain, actually, because it relies on consensus. Everyone knows that a consensus algorithm is why blockchain works, because everyone in the community, every one of the stakeholders and the participants has to agree, and they do agree, on who owns what. This economist cover called blockchain the trust machine, right? Those people in that society with using rye stones trust each other to understand how much money is in each account or who owns what. Blockchain allows us to achieve a similar mechanism of trust that normally we have to pay for court systems and police officers and lawyers to administrate so that we can trust each other when we do business with each other. Blockchain allows us to do those same things, but without having trusted intermediaries, and for a lot cheaper than all of the buildings of all the payment processors and banks and lawyers' offices in Manhattan, for instance. This is a smart contract. This is a visual representation of a smart contract. It's really simple. It just says, if this person pays this much money by this time, give them this website, right? This was written a very long time ago when 5,000 Ether didn't seem like that much to pay for a website. So, if we take Bitcoin, right, and we take a simple consensus algorithm that keeps track of payments, that looks a little bit like a new monetary system. Without those people, the state-sanctioned or the only anointed monetary systems being the only ones available, right? We now have something where creators, kids in garages, people that are normal, brilliant humans are now able to participate in what Hayek was saying was a better way to have sound money, right? He was saying, let's get a whole competitive landscape of monies. Let's get a whole competitive landscape of ways economies work. And you probably saw last week, Vitalik announced some plans for instance, changing the inflation rate of Ethereum, right? Normally central banks do that. Normally state-sponsored actors do that. And now we have a system where any brilliant kid in a garage can do that, as long as they can convince other people that it's a good idea and they can compete with each other to see who has a good idea. If you add smart contracts and you add the complexities of governance to that same consensus algorithm, now you're starting to do not only the same things as the banking system, but you're starting to do the same thing as whole governments, right? If we don't need to administrate rights claims, we don't need to administrate the machinery with trust and in some cases with violence, right? That we pay for with our taxes. Instead, we have a computer system that voluntarily allows us to all interact and to create together. Maybe this is a new nervous system. I truly believe if you look at human beings, human individual minds as cells in an organism, when we invented the internet, we added a new layer to our brain. Just like if you look at the human brain, there are three main evolutionarily distinct components of it. There's the inside part, the reptilian brain that makes you do things like breathe and not die and want to eat, and then you have the cerebellum, which is the next part that was evolved that has sort of medium-term planning, some dopamine systems in it. This is, for instance, the part that lights up when you click your Facebook feed or when you click your Instagram feed or when you get a like, right? This is what makes us do these cyclical behaviors over and over again. And finally, on top, you have the cerebrum, which is the most evolutionarily advanced, and that's also the part that has the long-term planning. This is the one that lets you value, a 10% chance of $1 billion in 50 years. So maybe what we're doing, if we already built another layer on top of human consciousness, on top of human cognition through the internet, where information can travel much more quickly between the cells in this organism that is our planet, what is the blockchain? Maybe the blockchain is a new vascular system to support that new part of your brain. This is the internet of value, right? The internet of information and the internet of value together look a lot like the necessary components to add another layer of cognition to the collective set of humans that are all here. We're also disrupting power structures that exist, right? If smart kids in garages can go raise these numbers, which are actually pretty small. When I made these slides, the numbers were a little smaller, but this is amazing. It's amazing that human beings can come up with an idea, they can route around the traditional systems, they can sidestep venture capital if they want to, and they can start playing in this domain that is normally the domain of only state actors and only the sanctioned, anointed few. I really think that public key cryptography, the fact that we magically discovered as humans that this thing exists and this allows us to have blockchain, that's pretty amazing. I think we should just take a moment to appreciate that. There's an adage I like from science, and I used to work in neuroscience a bit. There's a drunk professor who leaves the bar, and his grad students find him later down the street from the bar, and he's looking on the ground for his keys. He's under this street light, and the kids ask, "Professor, what are you doing?" He's like, "Well, I'm finding my keys." "Is this where you lost them?" He said, "No, but this is where the light is." And that's a good metaphor for how human science progresses. And it's amazing that the light of human consciousness happened to reflect upon this system, which happens to do for us what we spend trillions of dollars in taxes and commit violence to achieve. Now this simple mathematical property that our minds happen to find allows us to do those things. And this is kind of what I think it'll look like in my mind when we add this new layer to human consciousness. Thank you. I think there's a mic right there, and I think that's the only one, if anyone has any questions.
Can I go? Hi, you missed a line. This is my brain on crypto. Any questions? So are you aware of, you must be aware of the cookie test they gave to children about instant gratification versus long-term?
Sure.
So could you comment on the individual variability of the difference between, the short-term, the reward you get from the brain, I guess it's dopamine, when you do something for short, immediate gratification versus delaying it for long-term. And what I'm getting at is there's individual variability, and perhaps those who delay it are minors and hodlers, and the others are traders. So what do you think?
Sure. Well, the caveat being, I'm not read up on the most recent neuroscience on that, so the scientist in me doesn't want to comment on the statistical variability of that case. But yeah, certainly observationally, anecdotally, human beings, some of them are very good and some of them are very bad at delaying their reward for things. So good traders learn to separate their emotions from what they're doing, and therefore I think learn to tune down that dopamine response and just look at it like a cold piece of metal, and I think that's why.
Thank you. I would like to bring consciousness that when you deposit money in a bank, you are actually getting an IOU because the bank gets the right to do with that money whatever they want. In countries like the one I come from, South Africa, there's no deposit insurance. So if the bank is not properly regulated, the depositors lose the money. Now that we have a new paradigm with new technology, in your opinion, do you think we can hope that the central banks will realize that the model is not working, and therefore we should allow the depositors to hold their record of ownership of money under their own control, not to have to deposit that under a bank that will misuse your funds? Do you believe that we can believe that this can evolve to that extent?
Sure. I think central banks are full of very smart people, and they do have one really good tool. And I don't want to speak for central banks, but I think they're probably pretty comfortable with the current structure of things. But I think what Hayek would say, and I think what I'm saying, is that blockchain would achieve the mechanism that you just described, and let's see. Why don't we create a whole bunch, and we'll see who wins and which one functions better. Let them compete in the marketplace of ideas. And I think that central banks and I think innovators do realize that there's real value in this innovation. I wouldn't anticipate them shutting down tomorrow, though.
Okay. So in a nutshell, it's like create a parallel universe and let the evolution happen.
Sure.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Hi. How do we continue to organize using the technology while combating, actually, it's a great follow-up to that last question, combating the current models, the current powers, central banks, government authorities, without sounding like anarchists and questioning the current powers that be to the point where it's threatening? How do we do this in a way that's libertarian and that's moving the space forward and continuing to create ecosystems and networks and DAOs?
So, in a way, this is threatening, but in a way, this is evolution, right? I mean, banks all the time are developing technology in this domain. It's a little bit of the innovator's dilemma, because it's better to be disrupted than to disrupt. It's better to disrupt yourself than to be disrupted. But I think that they are very aware that they should work on that, and everyone at the end of the day are smart, normal human beings that work in all these institutions, and I think everyone wants innovation. Everyone wants to move it forward. So, a few years ago, I was scared.
I don't think the current groups want this innovation.
I imagine that there are definitely groups that don't. But in my experience, in working at Consensus, working with lots of large financial institutions, Fortune 500 companies, governments, there's a tremendous appetite for this, because it's an opportunity to create wealth. And while there may be those individuals, I don't actually see that. I was scared of that several years ago, but having done it for the last 3 years or so, people seem to want to innovate. I'm technically out of time. I don't know if I should get off. Yeah? All right. Sorry.
Well, thanks for your really inspiring and innovative talk, and I really appreciate the ideas you brought here. I think it's extremely interesting and important. I just want to make a very small technical point, not take too much time, and say that actually public key cryptography is, strictly speaking, unnecessary for blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And this is something to keep in mind, that it was something that was developed by the National Security Agency before it was made public by others. And it's well known in the field that digital signatures can be achieved without public key cryptography, so-called Lamport signatures. So just wanted to point that out as a technical observation. But yeah, thanks again for your really stimulating presentation.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll see all kinds. Thank you so much.